and evictions in South Minneapolis neighborhoods, and then is now doing a lot of work with 15 Now and all of the other low-wage worker organizations that are fighting for a $15 minimum wage. And he's going to start off in discussing Bernie Sanders tonight. And Kelly is a national convener of the Socialist Alternative Women's Caucus and a national organizer with Socialist Alternative. So yeah, Chris, if you just want to get started, I think that would be great. And I'll show you time.
Cool. Okay, thanks. So yeah, I like the photos that are up on the screen. So I think it kind of highlights why it's important for us to at least talk about and what should we say about the Bernie Sanders campaign? How should we orient to it? And how do we take it seriously? Because I think it's clear that there's a lot of energy and momentum and enthusiasm around Bernie Sanders, and also more importantly, I think around the program that he's fighting for and the ideas that he's raising. And just to kind of step back and think, to start, I think it's worth looking at, we're sort of living through a time where there's a real deep crisis in the two-party system in the United States. Congress has a 15% approval rating right now. 85% of Americans think that campaign finance should either be completely restructured or fundamentally restructured, which is basically the same thing. But it's a very widely accepted idea that there's too much corporate money that controls politics and that therefore nothing can get done. And there's record numbers of people registering as independents. And you also see this with the sort of anti-incumbent mood that happens over and over again, where sort of vote the bums out. So like there's 20% of Americans would support firing all of Congress tomorrow and hiring a fresh batch, or electing a fresh batch of people to start governing instead. But this shows, I think, how much frustration and anger there is directed at the political establishment right now. And it's flowing, I think, from the economic crisis. 28% of Americans feel that 28% of Americans have any faith that the economy will get better in the next 12 months, which is a really kind of scary statistic. And that hasn't been common for quite a long time in this country, probably since the Great Depression or the 1970s. And also, there's just this mentality is manifesting itself in interesting ways. So there's this new thing that came out where none of the presidential candidates are using the term middle class, which was like the most, over the last 30 years, every presidential candidate said, oh, we want to help the middle class, want to support the middle class. Now that term evokes anxiety and fear amongst many people who feel that their living standards are declining. And so the candidates in both parties are not using the term middle class. They say working families or working people or hardworking Americans or something like that, but they've completely abandoned the term. It's not because they want to do that. It's because of the deep economic crisis that people are going through and the fear and frustration that many people have. And there's a real left-wing mood in this country. You can see this in poll after poll. I'm just going to read off a couple more numbers, even though it sort of gets tricky at a certain point of how many poll numbers you can actually go through. But I think it's really illuminating. 60% of the people in this country feel that the economic system unfairly favors the rich. 69% support state intervention in addressing poverty, and that's almost half of all Republicans support that idea as well. And 78% feel that minimum wage should be high enough for anyone who's working to be able to raise a family, which frankly is actually probably higher than $15 an hour, which is the campaign that is getting a lot of prominence right now. 75% of people feel that climate change is serious or a very serious issue that's facing people. And I think the important thing is that which candidates are actually talking about this and how much of a profile do they have. And I think Bernie Sanders is is by far the sort of highest profile candidate that's raising any of these issues in a serious way. And that he has come out with, at least in words, a bold program to try to address some of these things. Bernie Sanders calls for $1 trillion public works program to get 13 million people back to work. He talks about getting the economy off of fossil fuels, about a $15 an hour minimum wage, about stopping the TPP, and all sorts of other issues. And I think there are real political weaknesses with Bernie. For example, his complete silence on the massacre in Gaza, something we should point out is that's not good. Bernie Sanders should take a strong position on that. And also his relative silence in accordance to police brutality, that he hasn't said Black Lives Matter. He hasn't openly criticized the police violence that millions of people of color face in this country. And I think that's a real weakness in his campaign. We want to point to that as that's actually something he needs to orient to, or his campaign should orient to get more people involved. But just to step back, I think it's important to recognize that the potential that his campaign has, millions of people could be mobilized around his program. And one idea is to kind of think about, imagine if there were hundreds or thousands of candidates like Bernie Sanders running on an identical program as him, that could get a huge echo in US society and move things forward. And I think that's kind of a thought process that we want to go through with people, is that it's less about who Bernie Sanders is and more about what he's fighting for and the positions that he is taking publicly. That's getting people really excited about his campaign, as you can see in some of the photos. I can't remember the last time that many folks came for sort of an insurgent candidate in the Democratic in Minneapolis, but probably since Ralph Nader would be the second largest rally to that size. But I think the clear thing we need to raise is that the biggest barrier that we're going to have to, like, what is the biggest barrier to achieving Bernie Sanders' program? And it will be the Democratic Party itself. And I think that we have to be very clear with people that it's a completely failed strategy for Bernie Sanders to run for the Democratic Party primary, and that'll be a dead end. And we need to raise that very clearly with people now. Just to walk through the logic of it, I think the by far the most likely scenario is that Bernie Sanders will not win the primary, but it's important to understand why. Programmatically, Bernie Sanders, probably more Democrats agree with his program than Hillary Clinton's and the positions that he is taking. But why won't Bernie Sanders win? Or why is it very unlikely that he's going to win? And I think we have to be clear that there's a corporate leadership in the Democratic Party that will stop at nothing to make sure that candidates like Bernie Sanders or someone running on a program like his are able to get through the primaries and run the party for their own interests. And there's a long history of this happening within the Democratic Party, and well-intentioned activists getting pushed into campaigns that aren't what they started for. And so you see that with like people who are excited about single payer who campaigned for Obama, only to have it not be single payer, right? That type of phenomena. But I think it's also worth just walking through other scenarios. So like, what if Bernie Sanders wins the primary in the Democratic Party and he's the nominated candidate? I think in that scenario, we should be clear. Is Wall Street going to let Bernie Sanders carry out a political revolution against them using a party that they fund? No, right? We have to be very clear that they will not. In the event that Bernie Sanders won the primary, the Wall Street and corporate money would stop flowing to the Democratic Party, and they would that would happen. That they're not going to just fund him to let him carry out this revolution from within the Democratic Party. That's not a viable option. In that scenario, we want to be clear of the limitations of relying on the corporate backers of the Democratic Party and why it's important for candidates to run independent of that and not have their campaigns tied to the types of money that typically flow into presidential candidates. But just to go further with the sort of what if scenarios, what if Bernie Sanders were elected president in 2016? What would that look like? And then I think it'd be clear that we would very quickly rush into the limitations of good ideas without like directly confronting Wall Street or the oligarchs that Bernie Sanders is targeting in his campaign and getting a very wide echo. And Bernie even admits this himself. He says, if I'm elected president, I wouldn't be able to carry out these things without a powerful movement of millions of people, that type of rhetoric. How much time has now? Okay. Sorry.
7.5 minutes.
Awesome. And I also think that would point to the limitations of what Bernie Sanders means by socialism. If he were elected president, how would Bernie Sanders confront Wall Street directly? How could he create a nicer playground for capitalism to exist in that doesn't hurt working class people? And I think just to walk through the scenario, if he was elected president, that he would brush into that very quickly and immediately be forced into a situation where we would need to build a movement to confront Wall Street. And I think but I think all of this is why it's important for us to start thinking about the Bernie Sanders campaign, and especially thinking about the folks who are really excited about Bernie Sanders, because they're coming from a very genuine place of wanting to see change. And I think they're excited about his program and they want to see it win. Our starting point should be an equal amount of excitement for the things that Bernie, yes, we agree. We want a political revolution against the oligarchs. Yes, we agree. We want corporate money out of politics. We want candidates that work for the 99%, not the 1%. And yes, we agree with all of these things. But what is the best strategy to achieve that? And I think with Bernie Sanders' campaign, what we can point to is that the idea that, it's not viable just to hope that he makes it through the primaries and then give up at that point, that the demands he's fighting for stretch far beyond the 2016 election, and also the Democratic Party's primary process, which we've seen time and time again is steeped against any sort of insurgent candidate fighting for genuine working class issues. We would want Bernie's campaign to actively orient to social movements, to be a vehicle for the fight for 15 and Black Lives Matter, to get their message into the presidential debates, to get their message out to millions of people who are going to be watching the 2016 elections and wondering about what to do. If his campaign actively oriented to that, that would be an important vehicle to get the ideas out further, and also, frankly, to get a lot of people who aren't paying attention to the elections back thinking about it. But fundamentally, I think we need to talk about what would it look like to build a real political alternative to Wall Street or to the oligarchs that run society. And I think it's clear that solely focusing on the Democratic Party is not a viable strategy to do that. And Socialist Alternative is, I think we need to be very clear about that, that we think that needs to be done independently. Imagine if there were thousands of Bernies running on a program like his, who are prepared to boldly challenge Wall Street, both outside of the two-party system, who are prepared to build mass movements behind their campaign, to fight for the demands that they're putting forward, and prepared to really start to confront the corporate interests that dominate our society. I think we can see examples of that with like the Shama Sawant campaign in Seattle, of what it looks like to connect. Shama Sawant's a city councilor in Seattle who was able to win a $15 minimum wage, but I think the key thing is that she saw herself and her campaign as a megaphone for social movements and actively oriented to that as a force in society. And I think that the potential exists right now to build a similar alternative throughout the United States, that there's no shortage of people who are upset with the political system, who are upset with the corporate control of politics and society. But the key thing is they're looking for a way forward. And I think we need to be really clear that we think the way forward is to build that alternative, to connect it to social movements, to bring things forward beyond that. And we think that Bernie Sanders at the moment right now is an important sort of figure in that process, but in no way should we limit that strategy just to him or to the Democratic Party, that we need something independent and we need to go far beyond the types of things, or politicians like Bernie as well.
Excellent.
All right. So I wanted to give a bit of a report and sort of political reflections on the event on Sunday. First, I watched Rachel Maddow, who I don't watch very much. She was covering the presidential primaries yesterday, and she said, she first went over like all the Republicans in the race. They have this big map of like the countless Republicans who are either in the race or are considering in the race, including people like Donald Trump, who's the least popular, to Scott Walker, who's the most popular among like people who are a part of the Republican Party, who are going to vote in the primaries where the polling is. But then she shifted and she said, quote, "But the biggest winner this week on any side has inarguably got to be Bernie Sanders in the presidential primaries." And after his campaign launch in Vermont, Sanders went to Iowa, where he spoke to a crowd that was larger than the population of the town, and in Davenport, where he held what the New York Times called the largest event for any candidate of any party so far this election season in Iowa. And then he spoke at two overflow events, one in Iowa and then another one here in Minneapolis. On Sunday, he spoke to thousands of people here at a rally. The media estimated that there were 3,700 people. The event was announced 10 days earlier, and they originally booked a venue for 200 people. Many of us were there, and you saw the line to get in was at least 6 blocks long. The overflow area, which is the outside picture up there, had hundreds of people in it. The crowd was, we should be clear about who was there. The crowd was majority white, older people, especially the people who showed up at 8 a.m. to make sure they got in on a Sunday morning. Not a surprise. But there was still a solid amount of young people. There were a solid amount of families, and there were a lot of college students there. I think this is a living testament to the potential for the Sanders campaign, even at this really early stage in the race. The campaign can get a big echo among the millions of people who are really disgusted with corporate politics that are making the rich richer and living standards for the rest of us lag behind. This is why the first Occupy movement and now the Fight for 15 have won such support across the country. It's also why there's increasing openness to the idea of a third party. And that explains how Shama Sawant in Seattle from our organization got almost 100,000 votes in 2013 when she was elected as a socialist to the Seattle City Council. The main themes that Sanders pushed in his 45-minute speech were income inequality and the corporate control of politics. In the first minutes of his speech, he made what is sort of become a now token call for a political revolution, which generated massive cheers. And overall, the energy of the event was like a rally. He would make big claims or big statements, and people were cheering. People were jumping out of their seats. It was a really explosive mood. Early in the speech, he talked about how the campaign isn't about him, that he wants it to be a basis for, quote, building a movement of people to stand up and fight back against the billionaire class. He said, the best president in the world cannot defeat the billionaire class. We need a mass movement of millions of people. And we agree. From a socialist standpoint, strengthening the struggles for economic and social justice will be actually more important than who's elected president in 2016. The key will be to use the 2016 elections to help raise the level of organization, confidence, and consciousness of workers and social movements. And the experience of our organization in Seattle is an example of what's necessary to build forces to run the strongest possible campaign and to win its demands. Shama and Socialist Alternative organized a grassroots force that elected the first socialists in 100 years, and then used the momentum from that victory to go forward and build 15 Now, which is a grassroots organization that mobilized hundreds of activists across the city and worked in coalition with labor unions and community organizations to push through the highest minimum wage in the country. But experience has shown again and again that the Democratic Party is really the graveyard of social movements. In recent times, we saw this when the Occupy Wall Street movement was brutally repressed by police forces under the direction of primarily Democratic Party mayors, and with the assistance of the FBI operating under the Obama administration. Even worse was how the Occupy movement was politically demobilized by elements tied to the Democratic Party with their appeals to support Obama against the Republicans in 2012. In 2004, the anti-war movement was systematically undermined by the rallying behind pro-war campaigns and especially of the Democratic Party nominee John Kerry. The Black Lives Matter movement, the Fight for 15, and Occupy Wall Street have greatly altered the political terrain on issues of racism and economic inequality, though. And so we're looking at a different situation right now. By comparison, much of the left has poured tremendous energy and resources into electing Barack Obama and Democrats only to see them advance the agenda of Wall Street. And that has also changed the experiences of people on the left. On Sunday, the most energetic point of the whole event, I thought, was, and people should come into this discussion and give reflections on the event too, was when Sanders pointed at a news camera and shouted, "Let me tell all the millionaires watching that TV, if I'm elected president, you're going to pay your fair share," which generated 2 different standing ovations while he was saying that. His campaign does stand in sharp contrast to the waffling and empty rhetoric of Hillary Clinton and other establishment politicians. That's real. People see that. He was one of the few members of Congress who voted against the Patriot Act and calls for dismantling the NSA's domestic spying program. He stands for bold action against climate change, demanding a rapid transition away from fossil fuels, like Chris said. He highlights his opposition to corporate power in the 1%, calling for overturning Citizens United and saying that his campaign is devoid of billionaires. He focused during his speech a lot on the Koch brothers as the key enemy, as well as corporations. He said that billionaires buy the elections and buy the candidates. And he made a lot of big statements like that without mentioning either major party, and I think that's significant. We think that, in our view as Socialist Alternative, he is making a fundamental mistake by running in the Democratic Party primary. Instead, we've argued that he should run as an independent to help build a political alternative to the corporate-owned political parties. There's a glaring contradiction also between his call for political revolution against the billionaire class and attempting to carry that out within a party that's controlled by that billionaire class. And you can see that contradiction playing out already. I don't think he mentioned the Democratic Party once in his speech on Sunday. He didn't even mention it.
He did. He indirectly criticized them. There was a point where he was criticizing the Wall Street conversation about cuts, and he didn't say Democrats, he said liberals.
Exactly, yeah. He didn't say Democratic Party. He didn't even say that he's running for the nomination. We know he is. That's what he's doing. He talked about being elected president, not about being the Democratic Party nominee. He talked about going to Iowa and New Hampshire in terms of the strength of, quote, this campaign, which is calling for a political revolution. He doesn't mention the primary in this speech. And with the outrage that exists against the 1%, his messaging struck a deeper note than had he spent his speech talking about his alliance with the Democratic Party. And so this is a contradiction that's already existing, and it will continue to get sharper. It'll be posed even more starkly when he most likely loses the Democratic primary. Sanders has said that he'll endorse the Democratic nominee, which is very likely Hillary Clinton. And that will mean that these mobilized people who are seeing a person who's fighting against the billionaire class, who wants a political revolution, who maybe for the first time or for the first time in decades are excited about a campaign. They're going to then be told to support a pro-corporate Democrat, the exact opposite of the revolution against the billionaires and oligarchs that he's talking about. And this could really result in a demoralization of the people who've been mobilized by the idea of fighting corporate power. And really, this is a loss of a historic opportunity. And so if you attended the rally, just to move on to other things from the rally, if you attended the rally, you noticed that he regularly mentioned race in terms of income inequality, but he never says racism. He never mentions the police or says anything sharp about the topic at all. He also doesn't mention immigration once. He talked a lot about restoring American democracy and about saving our great nation, even while giving the speech in the Minneapolis American Indian Center at the actual birthplace of the American Indian movement. And so these are some of the political weaknesses of his campaign that shouldn't be left unmentioned, that we should be clear about. But I also wanted to run through some of the demands that he emphasized. Jobs, Chris already mentioned. He calls for a federal jobs program. He does it sort of in bullet point form with lots of talking in between, but I'll do it faster than that. Raise the minimum wage. He has no specific number that he promises, but he says that we need to go from a starvation wage to a living wage, and the example he gave was LA going to 15. The no TPP, which was maybe the demand of all of these that got the most explosive cheering. Pay equity for women, paid sick leave and vacation time for all, single payer health care, free education, and he promised immediate legislation on that. That's the only one that he really specifically promised legislation on. And then high quality, affordable childcare for all. And the big point of the event, the last big point that he made, which was really effective, was to explain that all of these demands are possible, that we live in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and that by taxing the rich and corporations, that all working people, Chris is right, he used working people, he's working families, he even used working class a few times, that's all possible for the working class, for working people. And for members of SA attending the rally, I think this event was a confirmation of our perspectives and our approach to the Sanders campaign. There are millions of people in the US who are ready for a political revolution that rolls back the tide against big business. And over the next year, the main arena for discussion and debate on anti-corporate politics will be within and around his campaign. All of those forces which recognize the vital need for independent left politics need to orient to this large audience of people that will likely gather around Bernie Sanders. We need to be there. Yet the campaign is heading for a political crisis in 2016, when he will need to choose between supporting the Democratic nominee or continuing to run in the general election as an independent, which we support. Instead of dividing these forces by channeling some people who want far-reaching change back into the Democratic Party and thereby alienating a whole other section of people who are completely fed up with corporate politics and who want some sort of clear alternative, an independent campaign by Bernie Sanders, and not even just Bernie Sanders, behind a unapologetic working class fighter, whoever that is, could create the kind of unity needed to really challenge the capitalist oligarchy that's strangling our society.
Awesome. Excellent. I think Chris